"You don't have another appointment scheduled, sir. You can't just show up." The words snapped across the Veterans Affairs lobby like a slap against silence. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead as the woman behind the counter leaned forward, jaw set, voice raised for the entire room to hear. Thomas Bell didn't speak. He just stood there, tall, thin, 84 years old, in a worn field jacket and clean slacks, holding a neatly labeled folder against his chest with both hands. From the seating area, a man in a dress shirt muttered, "He's back again. Lives here more than the staff." A second chuckled, not softly. "Probably forgot he was here yesterday." The clerk let out a sigh, exasperated. "We can't keep doing this, sir. You've had your share of time. This is a place of process." The room buzzed with tension. Someone coughed. A child turned to stare. Thomas adjusted his stance, not from confusion, but from pain, his left leg trembling slightly beneath him. He didn't protest. He didn't plead. The security guard took a step forward. "You've had enough chances. Out. Now." One by one, heads turned away. No one moved. No one spoke. And still, the old man stood. Not defiant, just still. But not everyone in that room was ignoring him. If you believe every veteran deserves respect, subscribe, because every view helps this message reach those who need it most. The security guard's boot squeaked against the tile as he shifted his weight, preparing to escort the old man toward the exit. But Thomas Bell, ever deliberate, took a step backward first, one slow movement, followed by the soft metallic tap of his cane finding balance. He did not resist. He did not argue. He simply adjusted his posture as though reclaiming a scrap of dignity from the scuffed linoleum floor beneath him. The office was not crowded, but it felt full, heavy with the kind of bureaucratic fatigue only fluorescent lights and numbered ticket screens could conjure. To the left, two worn blue chairs stood empty beneath a faded American flag. To the right, a vending machine buzzed near a corkboard thick with outdated flyers, grief counseling, benefit seminars, a spaghetti fundraiser 3 months past. The air was dry, processed, no scent of coffee, no comfort, just air conditioning and distant toner. Thomas moved to the wall and lowered himself into one of the plastic chairs. It took 3 movements, first the lowering of the cane, then the shifting of his weight with practiced caution, and finally, the tight clutch of his folder as he sank down inch by inch, like a man folding a flag without letting it touch the ground. He did not sigh when he sat. He never did. Pain was not something he invited into the room, not unless it was already there. In the chair beside him, a woman in her 30s cradled a sleeping child against her shoulder. She didn't look at him directly, but her hand shifted closer to her bag when he sat, not out of fear, but out of discomfort, as if proximity to this man might require acknowledgement, and acknowledgement might mean something harder than silence. The digital screen above the counter beeped and advanced to, "Now serving A63. No one moved. Thomas's folder was organized to an almost surgical level. Inside, every page was marked with a color-coded tab, red for letters, green for medical records, yellow for denials. He opened it on his lap and flipped slowly to the middle section. His fingers shook not from weakness but from age, and still, the lines of motion remained clean, ordered. On the 4th page, a signature. On the 7th, a copy of a form that had been stamped 39 years ago in rust-red ink. Each morning he came here, always on a Monday. He arrived wearing the same field jacket. It had been his only outerwear for decades. The left shoulder still bore the faint stitching of a patch long since removed. The jacket was too light for cold weather, too heavy for summer, but it fit the way he moved, like something earned. Outside the front glass doors, a bus rumbled past. He looked up, not at the bus, but at the reflection. His own shape in the glass appeared ghost-like, faded. The edge of his jaw caught the light. The rest dissolved into the movement of traffic. A man across the room, 1 row down, took out his phone and scrolled. The screen's glow lit his face as he snorted quietly and said to the man beside him, "Wonder if he even remembers why he keeps showing up." The man beside him didn't respond, but he didn't look away either. Thomas turned a page. On the back of the sheet was an old stamp from a base no longer in operation. Its ink nearly vanished now, but still clear enough if you knew what to look for. He folded the edge, creasing it carefully, then tucked the page behind the others as if protecting it. Behind the reception counter, the woman who had spoken first now busied herself typing. Her fingers were aggressive on the keyboard. Not angry, just efficient. The way people type when they don't want to be asked anything more. Another voice came from the hallway behind the desk. Male. Relaxed. "Tell him to come back next cycle. We can't override the denial without a higher signature." The woman nodded and said nothing aloud, but her shoulders lifted briefly. Not in sympathy, but in quiet irritation. Thomas pressed his palm over the folder and closed it gently. Then he rested it against his knee. His cane leaned against the seat beside him, its handle wrapped in worn leather, hand-stitched with care. The bottom was capped in rubber, but the base was frayed from years of use. One of the pins just above the grip had been sanded down until only its outline remained. The other, a golden eagle, still gleamed in the light. A paperclip slipped off the folder and onto the floor. He looked at it for a moment, considered bending, but didn't. His hand reached slowly into his inside pocket and pulled out a handkerchief instead. Linen, cream-colored, pressed. There was a faint blue number stitched into the corner, a laundry code from decades past. He unfolded it, cleaned his glasses in quiet circles, and folded it again with the kind of attention a man might give to a prayer. His breath caught in his chest for just a moment, not from emotion, from the way age crept up in tight corners and narrow chairs. But he did not move beyond that breath. A child laughed in the far corner. His mother hushed him. A new number beeped. Now serving. A64. Still, no one rose. Thomas leaned back into the seat and closed his eyes. Not to sleep, but to preserve something. A breath. A memory. A sense of being still in the world, even if the world had long since moved past him. Behind him, near the wall of flags, a man stood with his arms crossed. Not an office worker, not a case manager. He hadn't moved since the first words were raised. He wore a suit, but his posture belonged to another life. Shoulders square, chin down. Eyes scanning the room not for time, but for truth. A name tag rested against his chest, but no one had read it yet. Thomas Bell did not know he was being watched. He only knew that another Monday had come, and still, no one had spoken his name. A ripple of laughter echoed from the row behind him. Short, nervous, the kind people let out when discomfort finds its way into small talk. Thomas Bell didn't look back. He sat perfectly upright, folder resting flat on his lap, both hands placed neatly atop it. The field jacket he wore bore no visible insignia anymore. The color had long faded into the greenish gray of dusted concrete, but something about the way it folded at the shoulders hinted at decades of wear, of formality, of use. Across from him, a man in slacks leaned toward his neighbor and whispered with a faint smirk, "Watch him count those pages again like they're going to change." His voice was just low enough to avoid notice, just loud enough to be heard. Thomas lifted the folder, opened it quietly, and rechecked the document at the front. A claim denial, stamped in red, corner curling. His eyes didn't scan it so much as rest upon it. Not reading, but remembering. The tile beneath his shoes was cold. His right foot tapped slightly, not in impatience, but in rhythm. A memory looped under his breath, inaudible to others. Perhaps a cadence, perhaps a prayer. Another man walked in from the hallway. Young, confident, lanyard badge swinging from his belt loop. He paused as he entered, saw Thomas, and immediately looked to the desk. "He here again?" he asked, already half laughing. The receptionist didn't answer at first. She just shook her head and focused on her screen. Then she said, without looking up, "Tried to walk in again. Still doesn't get it." Thomas did not look up. A chair creaked as someone leaned back. "You'd think after 30 years they'd stop trying to game the system," someone muttered. Thomas turned a page. The paper rasped slightly against the folder's edge, a sound small enough to be swallowed by the office hum, the printer, the thermostat fan, the occasional cough. From behind the glass at the check-in desk, a man peeked out. Someone give him a ride home already. A chuckle followed, then silence. Thomas's breath was steady, but he shifted slightly in his seat. His cane had begun to slide forward, the rubber tip dragging toward the space between his feet. He reached down, slowly, and pulled it back upright. His fingers wrapped around the grip like it was a rifle he'd carried before most of these men were born. In the far corner, the child from earlier pointed again. "That's the same old man from last time," he said to his mother. The woman nodded, but didn't answer. Thomas reached into his coat pocket and removed the handkerchief once more. The linen caught the overhead light as he unfolded it, and for a moment, just a second, there was a flash of blue in the embroidery. Numbers, faded to threadbare digits. He pinched his glasses between two fingers, wiped them clean with practiced care, and replaced them on his nose without haste. A soda can popped open somewhere nearby. The fizz hissed sharply in the stillness. Then came the scrape of a chair leg. A man 2 rows down leaned forward, elbows on knees. "Look at him," he said. "Takes 10 minutes to sit, 10 more to stand. Must take him an hour to tie his shoes." A few others smiled but looked down quickly. Thomas didn't react. Instead, he placed the handkerchief back into his breast pocket, folded to a square no larger than his palm. The receptionist called out a new number. "Now serving, A65. The room didn't move. No one was listening for their number anymore. They were all watching Thomas, or watching each other watch him. At the window, sunlight slid lower across the wall, casting a rectangle of pale warmth that never quite reached the chairs. Thomas shifted again, only slightly. His left leg twitched once, and his breath caught behind closed lips. One man finally said, "He should be home, not here. This is pitiful." Another responded, quieter, "Yeah, but what if he has no one there?" That question lingered. It wasn't answered. Thomas reached into the folder and removed a black and white photograph. The edges were curled, one corner torn. It showed 2 young men, both in uniform, arms slung around each other beside what looked like the back of a chopper. The smile on his younger face was unmistakable, crooked, tired, and proud. He did not hold the photo up for others to see. He looked at it only for a moment, then slid it behind a clipped stack of letters and closed the folder once more. The hum of the vending machine near the corner broke for half a second and clicked back on. The quietest sound in the room, and somehow the loudest. And still, no one had said his name. A soft shuffle of paper echoed as Thomas Bell reached once more into his folder, sliding free a document already worn from too much handling. The corner curled beneath his thumb, frayed slightly, edges yellowed like leaves left too long in the sun. A trace of red ink still clung to the bottom, the kind of stamp that had followed him through half a lifetime of waiting rooms and unanswered letters. He lifted the page carefully, holding it up just high enough to catch the buzzing fluorescent light. His eyes, though dimmed by time and fatigue, scanned the familiar lines not to find information, but to reassure himself that it still existed, that he still did. Thomas closed the folder halfway and placed it on his lap. The tiles beneath his shoes were cold, each a slightly different shade of dull white, worn down by decades of traffic. He tapped his foot once, not out of impatience, but to stretch the muscle. His cane, resting beside him, had shifted slightly forward. He adjusted it without looking. From the hallway came the confident stride of a younger staffer, quick steps, badge swinging, eyes locked on a tablet. As he passed the lobby entrance, his gaze swept across the room, paused briefly on Thomas, and then moved along. "He here again?" he asked the receptionist with a laugh already forming. She didn't look up, tried to walk in again. "Still doesn't get it," she said, fingers clattering against her keyboard like a typewriter caught in a hurry. Thomas opened the folder again and flipped to another page. He knew the order of the documents by heart, yet he moved slowly, as though savoring the weight of each sheet. There were copies of letters from offices that no longer existed, stamps from units long dissolved, and signatures from men whose names had faded from the national memory. He touched each paper not with desperation, but reverence, like pages from scripture only he could still read. Someone behind him snorted. You'd think after 30 years they'd stop trying to game the system. A second man replied, "He's just lonely. Comes here for the attention." Their words didn't sting. They didn't reach him. Or if they did, he didn't let it show. Instead, Thomas reached for his crutch. It had started to slide again, creeping away from the leg of the chair with a slow, deliberate lean. He tilted to catch it with his fingertips. He missed. The crutch toppled forward and struck the floor with a loud, sudden crack. It echoed off the tile, startling the clerk at her desk and pulling heads up from phones and magazines. The sound didn't match the object. It rang with the weight of something symbolic, something that shouldn't fall. Thomas stiffened, not from pain, from dignity. He leaned forward to retrieve it, hand shaking slightly now, not from weakness but from the sheer humiliation of needing to reach downward while eyes gathered above. No one helped. No one moved. He placed one hand on the arm of the chair and began to rise, lifting his body slowly, knees creaking, leg trembling under the uneven strain. His face didn't twist in pain. It stayed as it always had, composed, inward, resolved. When he stood, his balance faltered for a moment, and for that moment, he looked almost weightless, as though something long buried inside him might leave the body before the breath did. Then came the laughter. It wasn't loud, not cruel, but it was real. A smirk behind a hand, a chuckle from a throat. Someone whispered, "Come on, old man. Is this performance art?" A young employee with a clipboard passed by, barely glancing over. "I'd help, but I don't do cosplay Marines," he muttered under his breath. Near the water cooler, a man folded his arms and said, "Bet he bought that jacket at a thrift store. Probably never served a day." No one corrected him. The crutch lay between the chairs and the central aisle, not far, not hidden, and yet it might as well have been miles away. It was no longer a piece of wood and rubber. It was a symbol, and the room had chosen to ignore it. Thomas took a breath, then another, and walked, limped, the 3 slow steps toward it. He didn't ask for help. He didn't glance around. He didn't raise a hand. He knelt, slowly, painfully, and retrieved the fallen crutch with the same silence he'd carried through jungle mud 50 years before. He rose using only the weight of his left arm and the grip of the plastic chair. No sound escaped his mouth. No wince, no sigh. He simply returned to his seat and placed the crutch beside him again, correcting its angle with a gentle nudge. Behind the desk, the receptionist whispered into her headset, "Yes, still here. Walk in. Non-compliant. Same issue as last week." The child from earlier watched quietly. His mother placed a hand on his shoulder and gently shook her head, as if to say, "Don't ask questions." Thomas placed the folder back on his lap. His hand didn't tremble now. It rested flat, fingers curled slightly, as though protecting what was inside from the air around it. And across the room, the man in the navy suit uncrossed his arms. He hadn't moved since the commotion began. But now, his posture changed. 1 foot forward, hands at his side. Still, not hesitant, ready. His eyes didn't flinch. They watched only one man, Thomas Bell. Thomas Bell did not look around after returning to his seat. He did not acknowledge the room or the stairs, or the silence that had suddenly grown too heavy for the number of people present. He simply sat forward, his folder once again settled neatly on his lap, his hand placed atop it. Fingers curled slightly, not in defense, but in command. The moment was over, but not forgotten. And still, no one had spoken his name. He leaned to the side, reaching slowly into the inner pocket of his field jacket. The fabric gave a gentle crinkle as his fingers brushed the lining. Out came a folded square of linen, cream-colored, faintly yellowed with age, and stitched in the corner with pale blue thread that spelled out a small, nearly unreadable number. A laundry tag from another era, another continent. It was not a handkerchief of convenience, but one of memory, Not an accessory, but a keepsake. With measured care, he unfolded it once, then twice, and lifted his glasses from his face. They were not modern frames. Metal, round-lensed, a style long out of fashion, like something issued, not purchased. He held them in one hand and brought the linen cloth to the lenses, wiping in slow, circular motions that traced the edge of the glass like someone buffing a metal. His movements were smooth, restrained. They did not rush. Every detail, the pressure of his thumb, the way he rotated the lens, carried the rhythm of old discipline, of men taught to keep things clean before they let things break. The room had grown quieter. No new numbers were called. The staff behind the desk pretended to be busy, but even in their silence, their glances were stolen, not out of respect, but confusion. How could someone be so calm after being shamed? The child who had watched him earlier still stared. He no longer looked curious. He looked uncertain, as if beginning to understand that this man was not a figure of pity, but a presence no one else had the language for. Thomas placed the glasses back on his face, folded the cloth with the same precision he had used moments earlier, and returned it to his pocket. He adjusted the bridge of the glasses with 2 fingers, then pressed them down once against his nose. His folder remained still on his lap, like a shield, or a record. Then he exhaled, not dramatically, not loudly, just one slow, long breath through his nose, as if grounding himself inside a world that no longer made space for the order he once knew. His eyes moved to the flag in the corner, not the small plastic one taped to the desk, but the larger cloth one on a pole near the entrance. It was slightly wrinkled, hung at a crooked angle. He noticed, but said nothing. He reached into the folder again, not with haste, but purpose, and drew out a page marked with a clipped note at the top. It was a service letter, printed years ago, but the header still bore the embossed seal of the Department of the Army. He did not read it. He simply looked at it for a moment, then folded it once, gently, and slid it beneath a section marked Supporting Documents. There was no shaking in his hands now, only steadiness, precision. Outside, a car door slammed. A bird fluttered from a branch beyond the glass. The traffic light at the corner turned yellow, then red. The world kept moving, but inside, nothing moved. Thomas reached into the folder one final time and pulled out the old photograph. The same black and white image, now curled slightly at the edge, the corners soft with time. 2 young men, dirty, smiling, arms around each other beside a helicopter half covered in netting. One of them, the one on the right, wore a crooked helmet and the grin of someone who had just made it out of something awful. The other, thinner expression harder to read, held his hand in a loose fist by his waist. There was something fierce in his eyes, determined, tired, alive. Thomas stared at the image, not to remember, to bear witness again, to affirm that he had in fact been there, when so many who once had been no longer were. He did not show the photo to anyone. He did not lift it. He did not explain. He simply returned it to the folder, pressed it flat, and let the memory settle. Behind him, the whisper of footsteps, slow, steady, moved closer to the desk. Not from the hallway, not from staff. The man in the navy blue suit now stood in full view. His posture no longer passive, his presence no longer incidental. He walked with purpose, not quickly, not dramatically, but with the kind of gait that made people look twice. His eyes were fixed on Thomas, not in judgment, not in pity, in study. And still, Thomas did not look up. He simply reached forward, straightened the spine of the folder by patting it gently on one side, and folded his hands again. He had not spoken a word since entering the room, but everything about him had been speaking the entire time. The steady buzz of the thermostat hummed in the background, masking the kind of silence that didn't come from peace, but from caution. The silence of people who had said too much, too loud, too often. Even the clerk had stopped typing. Her fingers hovered just above the keys, as if any more noise would draw something unwanted. The room wasn't quieter because it had calmed. It was quieter because something had shifted, and no one wanted to be the one to stir it further. Thomas Bell remained where he was, unmoving, unreadable. The photo had been tucked away again. The handkerchief returned to its place. The folder, worn smooth in some places from years of handling, rested perfectly level across his lap. His cane leaned precisely at his side, angled inward, as though even it had been trained to stand at attention. Near the back wall, the man in the navy blue suit finally took a step forward. He had been standing beside the flag display, partially obscured by the edge of a filing cabinet and a potted plant no one watered anymore. From a distance, he looked like another official touring the premises, well-dressed, composed, silent. But now, as he moved into the center of the room, the cut of his shoulders, the stillness of his jaw, and the deliberate calm in each footstep revealed something deeper. Governor Cole Reardon did not stride. He did not hurry. He advanced like a man used to watching his words before they ever reached his mouth. There was no badge around his neck, no announcement. But the weight of his presence turned heads one by one. Some of the staff looked up sharply, then quickly back down. A few of the people in the waiting area sat up straighter, without realizing why. His aide, a younger man with dark-rimmed glasses and a stack of briefing folders clutched tightly in his arms, followed a few paces behind. He opened his mouth to say something, a reminder perhaps, or a question, but the governor raised one hand, palm low, a quiet command for silence. The aide obeyed instantly. Cole's eyes were on Thomas. Not curious, not judgmental, focused. He had been standing long enough to observe everything. The words, the laughs, the dropped crutch, the way the old man retrieved it alone. He had seen the way no one helped, the way no one called him by name. He took another step.
Someone near the sign-in desk looked up and did a double take, then leaned in to whisper something to the woman behind the glass. Her eyes widened slightly, then returned to her screen. She didn't make eye contact again. Thomas hadn't turned. Either he hadn't noticed the approach, or he had, and chose not to acknowledge it. His stillness remained total, not passive but intentional.
A kind of invisible armor built from decades of standing his ground in places colder than this, under skies louder than air conditioning vents and careless voices. Cole Reardon stopped 3 feet away from him. He didn't speak. He didn't offer a hand. He simply looked. He saw the frayed seam in the field jacket's left sleeve, hand-stitched, a thread color just off from the original. He saw the polished, worn cane, the folder, the hands resting upon it, steady, prepared, and he saw the boots, not military issue anymore, but well-maintained, worn but not neglected. The silence held between them like a flag yet to be raised. The child across the room whispered something to his mother. She leaned in, hushed him again, but her eyes flicked toward the 2 men, then stayed there. Something was happening. She could feel it. Reardon looked around the room once, slowly, not scanning, but measuring. He saw the glances, the lowered heads, the guilt that now hung in the air like a scent. Then he looked down again at Thomas. His voice was still, measured. "Has anyone helped you today, sir?" Thomas didn't answer. He didn't nod, didn't shake his head. He just lifted his gaze, and for the first time, their eyes met. No words were exchanged, but something else passed between them. A silent recognition that could not be taught or faked. One soldier, years removed from uniform, facing another who had traded his for a suit. 2 men who had walked into fire and now stood in something colder. Cole nodded once, a quiet acknowledgement. Nothing grand, nothing performative. Then he turned his head just enough to glance toward the desk. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "That man deserves a seat at the table, not a walk to the door." No one answered, because there was nothing to say. Governor Cole Reardon didn't move quickly. He didn't need to. Authority, when worn properly, doesn't ask permission. It simply arrives. He stood beside Thomas Bell, still not touching him, still not saying his name, but with his posture shifted just enough that no one in the room could misunderstand where his attention was placed. Thomas glanced up once more, meeting Reardon's eyes not with confusion or curiosity, but the same calm he had held since the moment he walked through the door. His expression didn't change, but the faintest, almost imperceptible tilt of his head was enough to register. "I see you." A beat passed, long enough for people to feel it, short enough for them to pretend they weren't watching. Then, without a word, Governor Reardon bent down. The room inhaled. He didn't stoop as a gesture of pity. His movement wasn't hurried or dramatic. It was deliberate, a man picking up a piece of something sacred, not fallen. His hand reached for Thomas's crutch, not to adjust it, not to offer it, but to place it exactly beside Thomas's right knee, perfectly aligned. It was as if the governor were returning a sword to its sheath. Then he stood again, straightened his coat, buttoned the top, let his hands fall calmly to his sides, and then, slowly, without speaking a word, he turned to face the room. Chairs creaked under shifting weight. Eyeglasses were adjusted nervously. A few mouths opened, then closed again. Reardon didn't raise his voice. He didn't address the crowd like a politician. He didn't identify himself. He just spoke, plain, clear, low. "On your feet." There was no emphasis, no threat. It wasn't barked. It was spoken, the way a father might speak when his children have gone too far. Silence pressed down harder now. Somewhere near the front, a man started to stand, hesitated, then rose, slowly, as if unsure why he was doing it. Then another, and another. A woman near the vending machine stood, gently shifting her purse to her shoulder. The young mother followed, lifting her child onto her hip, her face unreadable but pale with understanding. Even the clerk behind the desk stood, stiffly, her eyes darting between the aide and the governor, as if searching for protocol and finding none. No one asked why. They just stood. Thomas Bell remained seated, his face still turned toward the front of the room. He hadn't asked for this, hadn't gestured, hadn't responded, but he knew. He knew the feel of a room falling silent for the right reason. He had felt it before, in barracks before a name was called, in mess halls after a casualty list was read. He looked straight ahead. The man who had laughed before now stared at the ground. The young staffer with the clipboard held it tighter but didn't write a word. And still, no one had spoken Thomas's name. Governor Reardon didn't need to give a speech. His presence had already said enough. And as he stood there, not behind a podium, not in front of cameras, but beside an old man with a worn cane and a folder full of forgotten years, the room felt smaller, not in size, in pride. The only sound was the faint hum of the thermostat and the quiet rasp of a chair leg against tile as someone else rose to their feet. And in the corner of the room, the flag, wrinkled, slightly askew, shifted gently in the stale current of air. Still not straight, but noticed. Thomas Bell did not rise. He didn't shift, didn't blink, didn't look around to see who had followed the governor's quiet command. He stayed exactly where he was, spine straight, gaze steady. There was no need to acknowledge what had happened, because something far older than courtesy had already passed between them. Governor Reardon remained beside him, hands relaxed at his sides, eyes forward. The two men stood and sat, not as strangers, not as symbols, but as something quieter, something earned. Brotherhood isn't always formed in shared foxholes or battles. Sometimes it forms in the stillness that follows being seen after decades of being looked past. Their eyes met again, briefly. The recognition was subtle, but unmistakable. Thomas tilted his head by half a degree, barely enough for anyone else to notice. But Reardon understood it for what it was. Not deference, not gratitude, just presence, shared presence. Across the room, people began shifting, not in discomfort now, but in something that looked closer to reverence. The young mother adjusted her son's position on her hip, still standing. Her eyes moved between the two men, watching without understanding, but sensing the shape of what she was witnessing. Even the child had gone quiet, eyes wide, thumb pressed to his lower lip. The older man who had muttered about thrift stores earlier cleared his throat once, then looked down at his shoes. He stood now, not because he was told to, but because the weight of his own posture had become unbearable. The quiet around him had changed, and he was beginning to realize why. No one had yet spoken Thomas's name aloud, but in that moment, it didn't need to be spoken. Governor Reardon's expression softened, not with pity, but with clarity. His eyes flicked down for the first time to the folder on Thomas's lap, and the worn tab sticking slightly out from its edge. Then he noticed something else. A sheet of paper, pressed beneath the weight of the man's right hand, had slid just slightly loose. As Reardon shifted to adjust the fallen crutch earlier, the document had slipped forward, a few inches beyond the edge of the folder. Attached to the page was a photograph, black and white, warped at the corners, curling just enough to catch the overhead light. Two men. One of them stood with an arm slung around a fellow soldier, boots in the mud, eyes bright with fatigue. The other stood beside him, one knee slightly bent, helmet askew, jaw clenched in a crooked, reluctant grin. Both men were younger than anyone in the room now, but one of them wore a face that Reardon had studied 100 times before, on a mantel, in a frame, at a funeral. Governor Reardon inhaled sharply, not a gasp, but something close, a breath taken from deep inside the chest, where memory lives. He bent slightly, one hand reaching, slowly, toward the page. It wasn't permission he sought, it was reverence. Thomas didn't stop him. Reardon's fingers touched the edge of the photograph, his brow furrowed, lips parting as if to speak, but he didn't speak. His hand stopped moving, his shoulders straightened. He looked at the image, and then he looked at Thomas. Their eyes locked again, and this time, Thomas knew what the man had seen. He watched Reardon blink once, long and deliberate. Then, slowly, the governor reached inside the breast pocket of his suit jacket. No one else moved. Not the aides, not the staff, not the man by the door. He withdrew a small leather case. Nothing fancy, worn at the edges, corners softened by years of being carried close to the chest. From inside, he pulled a matching photograph. The same faces, the same day. But in this one, the angle was different, and the man on the left had his arms slung across Thomas's shoulders. Governor Reardon held the photo in the flat of his hand, not offering it forward, not comparing it for effect. He simply let Thomas see it. Thomas's eyes didn't widen. He didn't flinch, but for the first time all morning, his expression shifted, just slightly. The faintest ghost of a smile moved across the corners of his mouth. Not pride, not pleasure, recognition. He nodded once, slow and certain, and looked back at the original photo in his folder. No words were exchanged, but a story 30 years buried had just risen like a flag at half-mast. Governor Reardon didn't speak at first. He looked again at the photograph in his hand, then slowly returned it to the leather case, pressing it closed with careful precision. His face remained unreadable, but his breath came a shade slower, as if he were walking uphill in memory, not hurried but steady, knowing full well where the path led. Then he turned to the room, not with flair, not with formality. He simply turned. His voice, when it came, was low and quiet, the kind that carried because of what it didn't try to do. It didn't perform, it testified. My father was Sergeant Glenn Reardon. The name meant nothing to most of the people in the room, but that didn't matter. What mattered was how the governor said it, not with pride, not with grief, but with the weight of something finally ready to be told. He served in the Central Highlands of Vietnam in 1972, his last deployment. He didn't talk about the war much after he came home, just enough to let me know he'd left pieces of himself behind. Reardon's hands rested at his sides now, but his shoulders had squared. The stillness in him had returned, not cold, not rigid, just precise, measured. He once told me a story about the day he almost didn't make it out. The air inside the office had gone still. The humming vents, the occasional footsteps, even the printer had gone silent. There was an ambush. A convoy hit hard. Smoke, fire, confusion. My father had taken a bullet through the thigh. He said he couldn't walk, couldn't even crawl. He thought he was done. Reardon paused. Then someone came back for him. He didn't point. He didn't have to. He never said the man's name, just called him the Quiet Angel. A long silence followed, one that didn't feel awkward, just long overdue. He said this man dragged him 30 yards under fire, said he used his own belt to tourniquet the leg, tied it so tight he passed out from the pain, then carried him on his back through a field, half collapsed from his own injuries. Governor Reardon turned now, fully, to face Thomas. The old man sat motionless, but not unaffected. The lines in his face had softened, not melted. The hands that gripped his folder no longer clenched, but rested. My father died 8 years ago. He was never a sentimental man. But that photo, Reardon gestured toward the folder, was one of the 3 things he kept in the drawer beside his bed. That, a pocket Bible, and a letter from home he never mailed. Someone in the room shifted, the sound of a shoe sliding on tile. Reardon's voice dropped even lower, and still, it carried. I never knew who that man was, until just now. He looked around the room again, slowly, thoroughly, and I've been standing here for 15 minutes watching him be spoken to like he was a problem. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was crowded, thick with regret, awareness, realization, the weight of all the chuckles, the smirks, the muttered comments. Reardon exhaled once, sharp and short. I'm not here today as your governor. I didn't plan to speak. I came to tour facilities, check on backlogs, review some numbers, but I've seen enough today. His gaze swept across the staff, across the clerks, across the men who had laughed and were no longer smiling. That man didn't come here for sympathy. He came for justice. He turned to Thomas again, and his voice softened. You didn't ask for thanks, but I'm giving one anyway. He reached forward, not for a handshake, but to place one flat palm gently on top of the folder. A gesture of recognition, of transfer, of weight shared. Thomas looked up, not with surprise but with stillness. Their eyes met once more, and the room could not look away. Governor Reardon didn't ask for applause. He didn't wait for permission. He turned back toward the front desk with the same deliberate pace he had walked into the room with. Steady, grounded, decisive. His eyes didn't waver as he approached the glass divider, where the receptionist now stood frozen, hands hovering just above her keyboard. Her face was pale. She had stopped pretending to type minutes ago. Behind her, the aide who had followed Reardon throughout the facility earlier that morning stood wide-eyed, folder clasped tightly in both arms, saying nothing. Consider this his final appointment, Reardon said, not raising his voice, but somehow making it fill the entire room. There will be no more waiting, no more rescheduling, no more forms. Whatever backlog this man's been trapped in ends today. No one moved. No one protested. The weight of his words didn't invite challenge. They settled like stone. He turned his head slightly, enough to address his aide without breaking focus. Take down the name of the building's management office. I want a full review of intake policy by Friday. We're done ignoring stories like his. The aide nodded mutely and started scribbling notes, the folder pressed awkwardly against his chest as though afraid to drop it. Reardon turned back toward the center of the lobby. He scanned the space again, as if seeing it for the first time, not just as a waiting room, but as a mirror of how far some places had drifted from the meaning of service. He glanced at the plaque mounted on the wall near the entrance. Cheap, generic, probably hung years ago to name the building after some budget official long since retired. His jaw tensed. This building, he said, more quietly now, will be renamed by next week. A ripple moved through the room, not as noise, but as stillness. Heads lifted, brows furrowed. He looked back toward Thomas, who still hadn't stood, still hadn't spoken, only watched. Watched like a man who'd seen things offered before, only to be forgotten again days later. There was no suspicion in his face, no hope either, only presence. The same quiet presence he'd carried since the moment he stepped through the door. Reardon held his gaze and nodded once more. It will be called the Thomas Bell Veterans Hall. A quiet intake of breath came from somewhere in the back. The sound of someone swallowing, the shifting of shoes on tile. Thomas didn't smile, but the corners of his eyes softened, just slightly. He gave a subtle nod in return. Not one of gratitude, but of understanding, of acknowledgement, like one commander to another, like men used to promises that were either honored completely or not at all. Reardon stepped aside, letting the silence breathe. He didn't speak again. He didn't need to. Then, without instruction, someone began to clap. It was a single man, the same one who had laughed earlier, the one near the water cooler who had spoken under his breath just an hour before. He clapped once, then again. The sound was hesitant at first, the way someone steps into cold water, unsure if they belong there. But he kept clapping, and others joined. Not everyone, not right away, but enough. The room filled not with applause, but with release, restrained, almost reverent, not boisterous or theatrical. It wasn't celebration, it was atonement. The hands clapping weren't congratulating Thomas. They were apologizing, the only way the room knew how. The receptionist lowered her gaze. Her fingers touched the top of the desk as if searching for something to hold on to. The young mother bent slightly, whispering something to her son, who nodded solemnly and waved at Thomas. A small, innocent wave. Thomas didn't wave back, but his eyes acknowledged the boy with a stillness that spoke more than a gesture ever could. At the edge of the desk, the plaque that would one day be replaced remained crooked, but for the first time in years, someone noticed. The clerk who had once muttered liability stepped out from behind the desk, eyes lowered. She didn't speak. She only moved toward the crooked frame, lifted it from the hook, and turned it over, wordless, like removing a placeholder. 1 week later, the same sunlight stretched across the tile floor of the Veterans Affairs building, but the air had changed. It wasn't louder. It wasn't busier. If anything, it felt quieter, not silent, respectful. Even the hum of the vents seemed softer somehow, as if the building itself were trying to listen. The flag near the front entrance had been straightened, replaced actually. The cloth was crisp now, its edges freshly hemmed, mounted with care. Beneath it, a new bronze plaque had been installed, bolted to a polished wooden stand. It bore no quotes, no embellishments, just a name and a date. Thomas Bell Veterans Hall, dedicated to the quiet ones who never asked to be seen. There was no ceremony, no ribbon, just a handful of small changes that made the place feel deliberate, a little less forgotten. At precisely 8:58 a.m., the front doors opened. Thomas Bell stepped inside. He walked with the same careful pace as always, left leg dragging slightly behind the right, the weight of his body leaning gently into the crutch at his side. The same field jacket wrapped around his frame, its sleeves still bearing those quiet signs of care, stitched edges, worn elbows, and a faint hint of starch. His folder was tucked under his arm, though now thinner. It no longer sagged with old rejections. Just one set of papers, clipped neatly, marked, approved. He didn't look around. He didn't need to. He already felt it. The young woman at the desk, a different one this time, stood as he approached. Not rushed, not flustered. She stood because it felt appropriate. "Good morning, Mr. Bell," she said. No headset, no clipboard, just words, spoken with clarity and sincerity. Thomas nodded once. "Ma'am." A seat had been set aside near the flagpole. It wasn't labeled, but it didn't need to be. The chair was new. A simple wooden bench with a padded cushion and a small folded American flag on the table beside it. No one else sat there. Thomas made his way over slowly. Each step echoed less than before, not because the floor had changed, but because the people watching him had. As he reached the chair, the same man who had laughed days earlier was already standing nearby. Not waiting, watching. He didn't say anything. He simply moved aside to give Thomas room. When Thomas sat, the man nodded once, respectfully, and returned to his own seat. A moment later, the receptionist stepped out from behind the desk with a cup of coffee, black, in a ceramic mug. She placed it gently on the table beside Thomas's seat. "No cream," she said. "Just like you asked last time." Thomas looked at the cup, then up at her. "Thank you." She didn't smile wide, just enough. Behind them, near the entry wall, the new plaque reflected the morning light. Several visitors paused to read it as they passed through. Some saluted. Others just stood for a moment before continuing. At exactly 9 a.m., the flag was raised. No announcement, no trumpet. Just the quiet shuffling of shoes as everyone in the room stood. Automatically, instinctively. Thomas did not stand. He simply placed his hand over his heart. And this time, he was not the only one who did. A tradition had been born, not of banners or speeches, but of stillness, of standing for those who had carried the burden for decades while others looked away. A room that had once made space only for policy now made space for memory. And every Monday morning, without needing to be told, people would rise, not because it was required, but because a man had once stood alone and taught them what it meant to stand together. If stories like this resonate with your heart, like and subscribe for more untold moments of honor and kindness. Let us know where you're watching from, and if this moment brought back memories you carry with you. The best way to honor their memory is to keep listening. Click on the suggested video now, and we'll walk together through another untold chapter of courage and sacrifice.